My name is Isabella Rodriguez, and from 2017 to 2020, I worked as a wardrobe maintenance specialist for Lady Gaga's major tours and performances. I thought I was joining the glamorous world of high fashion and celebrity styling. Instead, I found myself in the middle of an occult war that had been raging in the fashion industry for generations. Most people see Lady Gaga's costumes and think about creativity, artistic expression, and pushing boundaries. They don't realize that many of those outfits are supernatural weapons disguised as haute couture, created by rival practitioners of fashion magic who view her as the ultimate prize in their ongoing battle for influence over popular culture. Let me explain how I discovered this hidden world, because understanding fashion witchcraft requires knowing how the industry really works behind the scenes. Lady Gaga's costume process isn't like other celebrities. She doesn't just work with one designer or fashion house. She collaborates with dozens of creators, each bringing their own aesthetic vision to her performances. What I didn't realize initially was that many of these fashion designers were actually practitioners of various magical traditions who embedded their supernatural intentions directly into the clothing they created. My job was to maintain these costumes between performances, cleaning, repairing, storing, and preparing them for future use. It was detailed, intimate work that required handling every piece of fabric, every sequin, every accessory. That's how I began to notice the hidden elements that weren't part of the official designs. The first sign something unusual was happening came during her 2018 tour preparation. I was examining her elaborate crystal-covered bodysuit when I noticed that some of the decorative elements weren't crystals at all. They were carefully carved protective amulets, each one inscribed with symbols from different magical traditions. When I asked the designer about the unusual materials, she gave me a knowing look and said, "Fashion is about more than aesthetics, Isabella. Sometimes we need to protect our muses from negative influences." That's when I learned about the rivalry between Helena Morgenstern and Vivienne Blackthorne, two of the most sought-after designers in Lady Gaga's circle. Both women were incredibly talented, but they represented opposing schools of fashion magic that had been feuding for decades. Helena practiced what she called enhancement magic, using clothing to amplify the wearer's natural charisma, creativity, and performance energy. Her designs were intended to make Lady Gaga more powerful, more magnetic, more capable of inspiring audiences and influencing culture through her art. Vivienne, on the other hand, practiced binding magic, creating garments that would tie the wearer to specific intentions, entities, or sources of power. Her goal wasn't just to enhance Lady Gaga's abilities, but to channel them toward particular purposes that served Vivienne's own magical agenda. The problem was that both women were creating costumes for the same performer, and their conflicting magical intentions were creating supernatural chaos. I started noticing the effects during dress rehearsals and performances. When Lady Gaga wore Helena's designs, she seemed more vibrant, more connected to her audience, more genuinely inspired. Her performances had an almost transcendent quality that went beyond normal stage presence. But when she wore Vivienne's pieces, something darker happened. Lady Gaga's movements would become more ritualistic, her lyrics would shift toward themes of power and control, and the audience would respond with an intensity that felt manufactured rather than organic. The real problem arose when Lady Gaga would wear pieces from both designers simultaneously. Mixing Helena's enhancement magic with Vivienne's binding magic created supernatural conflicts that manifested as equipment malfunctions, performer injuries, and audience disturbances. During one memorable performance in 2018, Lady Gaga wore a Helena-designed headdress with a Vivienne-created dress. The magical conflict was so intense that the stage lighting began flickering in patterns that resembled protective and cursing symbols. Backup dancers started experiencing vertigo and nausea, and several audience members reported feeling overwhelmed by competing emotional energies. As her wardrobe specialist, I was the first to discover the physical evidence of this supernatural rivalry. After each performance, I'd find new additions to the costumes, small objects, symbols, even herbs and oils that hadn't been part of the original design. Elena would secretly sew protective charms into the linings of her garments, usually focusing on health, creativity, and authentic self-expression. I'd find small silver amulets, crystals charged with positive intentions, and fabric that had been blessed with oils meant to enhance artistic inspiration. Vivienne would counter by adding her own hidden elements, binding cords woven into seams, symbols carved into buttons and zippers, and fabrics that had been treated with oils designed to increase obedience and spiritual dependency. But the rivalry escalated beyond passive magical additions. The two designers began actively cursing each other's work, trying to neutralize their rivals' influence while strengthening their own. I'd arrive at work to find Elena's costumes covered with strange stains that appeared overnight, seams that had mysteriously torn despite being newly reinforced, and decorative elements that had inexplicably tarnished or broken. These weren't normal wear patterns. They were signs of magical attack. Vivienne's pieces suffered similar sabotage, but in different ways. Her carefully crafted magical symbols would be found reversed or covered with neutralizing materials. Her binding cords would be cut or untied, and her empowered fabrics would lose their supernatural charge, becoming ordinary cloth. The situation reached a crisis point during Lady Gaga's 2019 Las Vegas residency. By this time, both designers were creating increasingly powerful magical garments, and their rivalry had attracted the attention of other practitioners in the fashion industry who began choosing sides. What had started as a conflict between two designers became a full-scale occult war involving covens, magical societies, and fashion houses across multiple countries. Lady Gaga, unknowingly, had become the focal point for a supernatural battle over who would control the magical direction of popular culture. The evidence was everywhere once I knew what to look for. Costume fittings would be disrupted by unexplained electrical problems. Fabric deliveries would arrive damaged or contaminated with unknown substances. Even the storage areas where we kept the costumes became charged with conflicting energies that made them unpleasant and sometimes dangerous to enter. But the most disturbing discovery came when I realized that both factions were using Lady Gaga herself as an unwitting magical focus. The costumes weren't just enhancing or binding her natural abilities. They were drawing power from her life force, creativity, and emotional energy to fuel the supernatural conflict between the rival covens. I noticed that after performances featuring heavily magical costumes, Lady Gaga would seem drained in ways that went beyond normal stage exhaustion. She'd be emotionally depleted, physically weak, and sometimes confused about decisions she'd made or statements she'd given during interviews. The magical practitioners were literally feeding on her energy to power their supernatural war, using her fame and influence as a battery for their competing spells and rituals. That's when I decided I had to intervene. Even though I had no magical training or understanding of how to safely navigate occult politics, I started by documenting everything I found, photographing the hidden symbols, collecting samples of magical materials, and keeping detailed records of which costumes produced which effects on Lady Gaga and her performances. Then I began secretly removing the most dangerous magical elements from both sides. The costumes weren't just enhancing or binding her natural abilities. They were drawing power from her life force, creativity, and emotional energy to fuel the supernatural conflict between the rival covens. I noticed that after performances featuring heavily magical costumes, Lady Gaga would seem drained in ways that went beyond normal stage exhaustion. I'd carefully extract binding cords, neutralize cursing symbols, and replace empowered materials with ordinary alternatives that looked identical but carried no supernatural charge. It was dangerous work. Both Elena and Vivienne quickly realized that someone was interfering with their magical preparations, and they assumed their rival was responsible. The supernatural attacks escalated dramatically as each faction tried to overcome what they perceived as increased opposition. During this period, Lady Gaga's performances became increasingly unpredictable. Some nights, when I'd successfully neutralized most of the magical elements, she'd give inspired, authentic performances that felt genuinely her own. Other nights, when I'd missed hidden magical components, she'd seem to be channeling forces and personalities that weren't entirely hers. The situation came to a head in late 2019 when I discovered that both Elena and Vivienne were planning a final magical confrontation using Lady Gaga's New Year's Eve performance as their battlefield. Elena had created what she called a liberation dress, a gown designed to permanently free Lady Gaga from all magical influences and return her full creative control over her own performances. The dress was embedded with protective elements from dozens of different magical traditions and charged with intentions of artistic freedom and authentic self-expression. Vivienne countered with a submission corset, a garment designed to permanently bind Lady Gaga to Vivienne's will, making her a puppet for whatever magical agenda Vivienne chose to pursue. The corset was woven with binding cords from various occult traditions and charged with intentions of control and spiritual dominance. Both pieces were incredibly powerful, and wearing them simultaneously would have created a magical conflict intense enough to potentially kill Lady Gaga or drive her permanently insane. I realized I had to make a choice that would end the supernatural war, even if it meant sacrificing my career in the fashion industry. On the night before the New Year's performance, I broke into the costume storage area and destroyed both the liberation dress and the submission corset. I used methods I'd learned from months of watching magical practitioners: salt, iron filings, running water, and fire, to neutralize the supernatural charges in both garments. The destruction wasn't subtle. Both Elena and Vivienne arrived at the venue to find their masterworks reduced to ordinary fabric and ash. The magical confrontation they'd been planning was impossible without their prepared weapons. But rather than ending the conflict, my intervention forced both factions to confront the reality of what they'd been doing to Lady Gaga. Seeing their magical preparations destroyed made them realize how their rivalry had escalated beyond reasonable boundaries and was genuinely endangering someone they both claimed to want to help. Elena and Vivienne met privately before the performance, and while I don't know the details of their conversation, they emerged having reached some kind of truce. They agreed to limit their magical interventions and to coordinate their efforts rather than working in opposition. Lady Gaga's New Year's performance was extraordinary, not because of supernatural enhancement, but because she was finally performing without magical interference for the first time in years. She seemed more present, more authentically herself, more connected to her own creative vision than I'd seen since I started working with her. After that night, my role changed significantly. Instead of just maintaining costumes, I became an unofficial mediator between the various magical practitioners in Lady Gaga's fashion circle. My job was to ensure that their supernatural contributions enhanced rather than exploited her performances. I learned to recognize the signs of beneficial versus harmful magic in clothing. Protective and enhancing elements that worked with Lady Gaga's natural energy were acceptable, but binding or controlling magic that treated her as a tool rather than a person was strictly forbidden. The fashion world's occult community gradually accepted these boundaries, partly because Lady Gaga's performances improved dramatically once she was free from magical exploitation, and partly because the practitioners realized that cooperation produced better results than competition. But my experience taught me that the fashion industry contains a hidden layer of supernatural activity that most people never see. Many of the most influential designers, stylists, and fashion houses incorporate magical practices into their work, using clothing as vehicles for spells, rituals, and supernatural intentions. Celebrity fashion isn't just about appearance. It's about power, influence, and the ability to shape culture through supernatural means. The people who dress our most famous performers aren't just artists and craftspeople. Many of them are magical practitioners using fashion as their medium for occult work. Lady Gaga's experience was unusual only in its intensity and the openness of the supernatural conflict. Most fashion magic is more subtle, but it's everywhere once you know how to recognize it. The symbols hidden in designer clothing, the materials chosen for their magical properties rather than their aesthetic qualities, the rituals performed during the creation process. All of this is standard practice in the higher levels of the fashion industry. If you've ever wondered why certain outfits seem to transform the people wearing them, why some red carpet appearances create cultural moments while others are forgotten, or why particular designers seem to have supernatural influence over trends and taste, now you know. Fashion is magic, and the people who control fashion are modern witches using clothing to cast spells on a global scale. Lady Gaga was just one battle in an ongoing war over who gets to shape human consciousness through the clothes we wear and the images we see. And that war is still happening, in every fashion show, every magazine spread, and every carefully styled public appearance by the people who influence our culture. The costumes may look beautiful, but some of them are weapons in a supernatural conflict most of us never see. Many of the most influential designers, stylists, and fashion houses incorporate magical practices into their work, using clothing as vehicles for spells, rituals, and supernatural intentions. Celebrity fashion isn't just about appearance, it's about power, influence, and the ability to shape culture through supernatural means. The people who dress our most famous performers aren't just artists and craftspeople. Many of them are magical practitioners using fashion as their medium for occult work. Lady Gaga's experience was unusual only in its intensity and the openness of the supernatural conflict.